Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our next ICP lunch seminar. This lunch seminar is a series of 20-25 minutes presentations on specific projects that ICP is working on. The main purpose of these seminars is to present the main findings of the projects, what we have achieved, what are the methodologies used, and some key lessons that can be useful both for the European Commission, but also for other related stakeholders for each project. Most of these projects, of course, deal with the energy efficiency issues and energy efficiency policies, while we also have other projects on climate and climate policy and also renewable energy issues. Now, on today's project, it will be the ICCEE, which is a new one that was started in September, and it it's an industrial type of project, and it deals with a cold supply chain from the food and beverage sector. So our colleague Deger Saygin, who is mainly working on this project on behalf of the ICP team, will present some basic findings and some first lessons. Deger, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I just sent you a request, I think, to share my screen, which I just did.
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Thank you, Flasis, for the introduction. I just realized your logo is whiter and mine is quite dark. I have a bit more different logo than yours, but at the end of the day, as you said, we are looking into the cold supply chain energy efficiency, which is typically overlooked energy consumption in the food and beverage sector, and I'll try to explain why that is and what's its relevance in general to especially EU's industrial energy demand at the moment. And I'll also try to talk a little bit about the food sector and how that links with the overall climate change, especially given the email we received from our colleague for the Paris Rainforest project. And food sector is generally seen as just a single industrial energy users, but it has, as you may have followed from the recent IPCC report, has quite some consequences on the climate change. So that's why I have put a little bit emphasis on that also. Now, when I say the link between food consumption and the climate change, actually what we mean in terms of the total contribution to anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions is in the order of 20 to 37%, which stems from a mix of activities, including agriculture sector, livestock, and land and forests needed to raise the different types of crops, meat products, and even fisheries. So this includes both pre and post production of food products. So basically that's around a third of all GHG emissions. Meaning what you do in the food sector supply chain, if you develop ways to reduce your emissions in the food supply chain, that's a major contribution to climate change mitigation. Obviously, there are quite easy ways of doing that, and one unfortunate statistics here, again coming from the recent IPCC report, is about the total food lost or wasted globally. That's in the order of 25 to 30%, and just to make that a bit more tangible, out of the one loaf of bread you buy every day, a quarter is going to waste. So that's quite a number, unfortunately. And that also has indirectly contribution to the GHG emissions worldwide, and the estimate for the period between 2010 and 2016 indicates 8 to 10% of all GHG emissions coming from the global food loss. So just these figures to emphasize the importance of the food and beverage sector, which we typically see as some small sector. And it's more or less the same figures, but a little bit the ranges. Obviously, there's much uncertainty around these numbers. So what you see here is with the dark blue shades is the lower, and the light blue shades are the range of the upper estimates from different stages of the food value chain. And as I mentioned, around a third of all global GHG emissions comes from the food supply. Now, this may be somewhat, or it's only partly nowadays relevant for the EU, as the income levels are relatively higher than the rest of the world. But the typical trend, what we see is as we become richer, we tend to eat more. That's indicated by the kilocalories per capita per day. So that's in the order of, say, between 2,500 to 3,000 kilocalories per day. And what's also interesting within this is that the share of calories from livestock increases with also income levels. So for a country with around $10,000 GDP per capita, 20 to 40%, so 1/3 of all calories comes from meat. And 1 ton of meat requires 3 to 10 tons of grain. So that, just to give you the impact of that and how the GHG emissions are impacted just from one part of the food sector, meat consumption. And that has raised quite a number of interest in the investment side. And this is a recent figure from this autumn, that there is significant investor interest towards more, say, in brackets, sustainable protein. That's, of course, one could argue on social and economic aspects, but there's significant investments on these more lab-based proteins. And another option which is being typically discussed to reduce such GHG emissions is aquaculture, which already currently accounts for half of all fish supply, and there is interest towards increasing that share. Of course, this is also implications for the EU, but also for the, especially for the Asian population, which tends to rely on more fish-based foods. But that has also some environmental consequences on the wild species if it's harvested. I'm just saying these to put the problem in context about food consumption. And obviously, very typically discussed is vegan, vegetarian type of diet habits tend to be more or less CO2 emission intensive compared to other types. But of course, I just wanted to share this to show you from the, again, the IPCC report, how these different dietary habits have different GHG emissions. Now, let's look at the, instead of now the entire value chain of the food sector, now let's focus a little bit on the, say, factory gate energy demand. So processing related energy demand in the food sector, and this is a figure from the EU 28. And given the relevance of more energy intensive manufacturing industry sectors have in the past few decades have shifted in the EU, food and tobacco sector, including the beverage production, is now currently the 4th largest contributor to the industrial energy demand. So this is an interesting figure. Because if you look at, for instance, the US, Asia countries, or some of the Latin America countries, food and tobacco generally ranks 6th or 7th, but in the EU has quite a high relevance. And if you look at the split of the energy demand from the food sector, interestingly, gas and electricity accounts for a large share of that energy demand. And obviously, depending on the country, gas has import-related issues, and electrification or electricity demand is obviously important, but these also, of course, raises questions how you use that electricity load, what's the source of that electricity, how you manage that. And maybe one final thing, generally what's typically discussed when it comes to food sector is it has lots of byproducts which are sort of waste or renewables based or bio-based, biogas type of thing. But despite all the arguments around that, current contribution is only 4% in the sector. So there's a big issue on fossil fuel reliance and in terms of the energy intensity of the sector. And I'm talking about the EU. Now, that said, the food sector, besides its large contribution to the total industrial energy demand, it's also an important sector when you monetize the output of the food products. And in the value added contribution from food manufacturing is 12.8% and a significant contribute to the employment and represented by a large share of what we call small and medium enterprises. So it's at the heart of the EU economy as well. Now, the interesting thing about the food sector, it's actually quite a complex sector. And what I mean with that, the outputs vary significantly from dairy products to fish products to different meat products, beverages, and within each of these categories, there's even subcategories. And that, despite similarities, say, when you call dairy production, if you look at the production processes, even within those different dairy products, there's a significant variance in processing. So different temperature levels, different levels of refrigeration needed, different distillation and separation processes. So it's quite a complex in terms of managing the production processes, which requires tailored technology approaches. So that makes the sector complex in terms of what type of energy efficiency measures you implement and so on. So these need to be understood within the subsectors of the food production chain. And as I try to put in context the contribution of the food consumption to the greenhouse gas emissions, one can also express those in terms of the energy demand from raw material preparation to the logistics. And here's a representation of that for different types of food products and how the energy demand changes between or the breakdown of the energy demand changes between different products. And wholesale and retail, which we often don't associate with food production or food supply chain, actually accounts for around a third of the total energy demand, and processing, which is what we typically think is related to food production, is around 20 to 50%. So food processing obviously is an important one, but it's not the only one. And the whole chain, including also farm agribusinesses, packaging and freight services, which is also part of the ICCEE project, is quite important in terms of the supply chain. So what do we mean with the supply chain, and in particular the cold chain? So the logistics, and so basically it's not only from the factory gate to the wholesale retail, but before the factory gate there is also logistics involved in the food production. And throughout these logistics there is a need for temperature control in most of the food products, which means refrigeration. That's a high user of energy, and that's what we mean with the cold chain logistics. So some products need pre-cooling, and after that transport generally requires for such pre-cooling products also cooling along the way, let's say, and there is typically mid point storage needed. And finally, if you look at the end customer level, so that's your retail or your supermarket, factory, or even some port logistics that can be seaports or airports, they're also generally cold needed. And throughout this, as you can imagine, a 5-step called supply chain infrastructure in the food sector, and that's interesting. Majority of the companies are small and medium enterprises. So that's a scattered structure of this sector, which requires quite some attention, and that's what we try to address in this project. We look at majority in our stakeholder group consisting of small and medium enterprises. Now let's focus a little bit on the ICC objectives, and I'll very briefly take you through that. And I also will try to explain you what we did so far in the past 1.5 to 2 months. So we look at the entire cold supply chain. And when what I mean with looking at that, we try to understand what kind of energy efficiency measures could exist, how different companies, SMEs, compare with each other in terms of their energy demand, and how this energy demand can be reduced in the short term to reduce this electricity demand, which I showed you. And so that's basically what is used for the refrigeration part. If you look at the ICE's 2 pillars, let's put it that way, there's an analytical pillar, and then comes the stakeholder pillar, which is, I think, makes this project exceptionally interesting. The analytical part is building on a tool which we are going to develop with the partners. So the idea there is to understand how the energy is flowing actually across the supply chain, because this is generally not measured, and so far there is no really landscape of the energy flows in the cold supply chain, even for the EU or even for most member states. So that's already a big knowledge gap the project will fill. And obviously, there are environmental impacts which come from these energy flows. We will be identifying the major processes which consume the electricity, and obviously refrigeration is one of them, but there are others across this supply chain. So we want to understand the big fish that lies there, where we can reduce the energy demand. And there's an LCA sort of life cycle assessment linked to this whole supply chain, which we want to understand. And there is a lot of course, as we all know, beyond the savings on the energy bill, there's much on the non-energy benefits which can be gathered. And also we want to link those benefits and opportunities from saving energy efficiency with tools and measures about how financing can be created to achieve these energy savings. And this tool will also allow us companies to benchmark themselves. So that's of course going to be an anonymous data exercise, but it will show what the gap between the best and the worst, and what's lying in the middle, and how different companies can improve their energy. With the learnings we gather from the tool, this will be transferred into capacity building with predominant focus on the non-energy experts. The idea here is to create sort of an energy culture. So create awareness and knowledge on these opportunities, and ideally result in behavioral change, and that's obviously generally no-cost saving measures. And of course, this will also help us to identify some of the barriers to overcome the lack of implementation of energy efficiency measures identified in the audits. And subsequently, this will be also a network exercise between different SMEs we are not able to reach. As I mentioned, there's 300,000 SMEs in the food sector, so that's quite a challenge to address all of them. So that network exercise will help to spread the information, but we will also do quite a number of on-ground trainings and workshops at national, regional, and the EU level. And the e-learning module will create the link between these on-ground activities and the network activity. So the project comprises 13 actors or partners from several countries, and we include here the typical food beverage countries. But please also bear in mind that, for instance, countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, actually hold quite a number of the cold supply chain SMEs. So we are also including such companies. The project has, in principle, 5 work packages. The first and the fifth are generally known, but the second, third, fourth is where the difference lies. So there is the, say, the analytical framework before the tool is being prepared, and I'll tell a bit about that. And the tool and resources are being created in work package 3, and this both leads to the work package 4, which is the capacity building. So first, in the work package 2, we will try to understand who the supply chain actors are. So that will be the first step in drawing the landscape, and that will subsequently lead to the life cycle assessment and costing across this supply chain, and several other analytical exercises will follow that, which will lead to the tool creation. In the tool, basically what I explained, there will be significant data inputs from the companies, which we will be using to assess the performance of the sector, and this will create the results which we need for what the energy saving potential, which companies and which parts of the supply chain can do, what are the benefits, what are the non-energy benefits, and so on. In the work package 4, there is a significant training program, national level courses, subsequent to that regional and EU level workshops and seminars. A web-based platform will be developed, and we'll have a monitoring exercise in there. I will not talk too much and take you into the detail of the impacts, and this is my actually last slide before the last one. As I mentioned, there will be the national EU workshops and the e-learning exercise, which will hopefully increase the outreach and impact. So far, the work package 1 is more or less complete. Web page is complete, but pertaining some of the final corrections we're making, so that should be out before end of this month. The stakeholder engagement has started. It's linked with the web page, so we will be able to collect and find out which companies are where and active in the supply chain. And finally, interviews with a wide range of stakeholders have started to understand the behavioral issues, barriers, and how they see energy efficiency in supply chain food sector. So thank you very much for your attention, and happy to discuss with you more details of the projects.
Thank you very much, Deger, for that. Any questions you might have? Start from the group here.
Hi, Deger, Philippos here. A short question. You mentioned that it's mostly for SMEs. So is there a strict limit on SMEs, or will the project reach out to also larger players in the sector?
Yeah, so it's the main focus is on SMEs, but we cannot exclude here the large enterprises, and that's we discussed that actually quite heavily in the kickoff meeting. We will not make a distinction in the very first stage of the project whether you're an SME or a large enterprise. We will try to engage everyone, and based on that, we will develop a strategy towards more SMEs. But if there are useful large players, also we will incorporate them in data collection and in terms of these interviews, etc. So that's sort of the idea for now. And obviously, the sector associations, which is at the center of this project, which actually one of them is part of the project, they will also help us to reach out to the SMEs through their network. So through that, we are thinking that we will be able to cover more SMEs than compared to large enterprises.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, Deger, it's Mia speaking. I have one question. I really like how you started with this ecological footprint and trying to show the effects to somebody who doesn't really understand this topic. So in the end, my question is, how will you do this consumer outreach, and how will you show the benchmarking? Will it be through this ecological footprint in hectares? Will it be through the Sankey diagrams, or through energy efficiency labels and rating? Because you showed all of them. In the end, will you go through with all three of them?
Yeah, so I think the first idea here is to understand actually what the cold supply chain contributes in terms of to total energy demand across the supply chain. That is something we don't really know. We have a rough idea of refrigeration needs, and that obviously you can link them to electricity demand, but still in the across supply chain, that's something we don't know. So we want to first quantify that. And that will be all public information, obviously. But then you have the benchmarking exercise, which then leads to some company-specific data, and I think we need to be a bit more selective there. You know, you want to certify that, you want to label different countries, but that will also show across the supply chain and within the parts of the supply chain which companies are doing what. So we will be able to get sort of a range there. And I think we can start saying, okay, guys, I mean, you are in the, I don't know, first 25%, you have this much potential in this part of the supply chain, and that will, we will do it in that way. And we have to see a little bit how ambitious we should be across, like you suggested, in all these three areas. I don't think we can try to push for all. I would be a bit more cautious, and this is something we discuss. First, get the numbers out, collect as much data possible, to make this take the picture of the sector in terms of the energy demand, and then quantify the life cycle impacts, and that's something easy to do again also, and then try to look at the company specific data and try to draw conclusions based on it.
Thank you.
Okay. Any final question from our side? I think we're done also with the time.
Jean-Sébastien speaking. A quick question. You mentioned that, if I understood well, the approach includes energy audits, tailored energy audits. So will you look at the possible links with the scheme that member states implement to promote energy audits for SMEs, which can be a way to find funding for companies to be, let's say, active on that?
Sure. I mean, this is the starting point anyway, so I mean, we are not excluding that. It's part of it, yeah.
Also, maybe at this stage, it's nice to mention that all the group has started the interviews with the various parts of the supply chain in the cold part. So we're carrying out interviews in several countries, also with the networks, of course, that are representing the consortium, but also between the partners. So I guess that in the coming months we'll have some results on the specific requirements, the specific energy use and types of needs that the whole supply chain has. Okay.
Hello, this is Vangelis. I understand that the project is most related in energy efficiency, but I would just like to mention that in Transrisk, there was some case studies regarding CO2 emissions. So if you want, you may take a look. It was a case study in the Netherlands from Jean and in Indonesia, and also there was of course on the approach of climate change mitigation and CO2 emissions. There was a modeling of behavioral change of consumers regarding the food, their food desires, and how if they change that, how the relative respective CO2 emissions would change. Perhaps this could be useful also from the aspect of energy.
Okay, thank you very much, and that I'll contact you separately.
I have in the chat box some 3 links. One for behavioral change, the reports for behavioral change, the IMM in Netherlands, and the manure management in Indonesia. But of course you can contact me.
Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Okay, so this is also the link of the website, which is being now developed. And as we said, the videos will be uploaded on the YouTube channel of ICP and for partners who would like to have a look. And feel free to contact also Deger or myself for any questions concerning the project. Thank you very much. And in a couple of weeks, we'll be moving on with the next land seminar. Thank you all for the attendance. Have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye, guys.